Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post. Also, don't forget to like all the questions that you have, as well as ask any new questions that you have. And so, yeah, this week there actually weren't as many questions as usual. So I'm actually planning on answering every single question that has been asked at this point in time. So I'm filming this Q&A a little bit earlier than I usually do. So maybe some of you guys will ask a question in between the date that I film this and the date that this Q&A actually comes out. So if you're that person, go ahead and copy and paste that question onto this Patreon post. And also, yeah, if you have any questions that you're thinking about answering, but maybe you're hesitating for whatever reason, definitely go ahead and ask it, because there's been less questions than usual recently, and so it's really likely that I'll answer your question. So let's jump right in. Alfie asks, you seem to really stress the importance of subs and comprehensibility in this last Q&A. Should I prioritize the comprehensibility I gain with subs, or watch more raw to improve my pure listening when I still can't hear words/comprehend sentences that I am certain I would/should know? A little bit cryptic there. By this, I mean I still can't hear words that I know I've Anki'd or seen before, and I can't comprehend full sentences quickly or easily enough while listening. I'll hear a sentence and it will seem familiar, but I won't get any of it at all while listening raw. However, when I pause and read the subtitle line, I understand it easily. Yeah, so it sounds like this person is reporting having a gap between their reading ability and their listening ability. Very normal thing that pretty much everyone is going to experience. So yeah, when you're watching with subtitles, that's basically reading, because you have the text right there in front of your face. And so anytime there's a word it's very easy to notice. You can also pause and take your time, process all the grammar, if you know all the grammar structures. Whereas when you're listening, it's really fast, it's blurry. Maybe you know the words, but you can't pick it out because it's just going by too quickly and you don't have enough time to process it, or it's too blurry, your ears can't pick it out. So it's very normal to have this gap between your reading ability and your listening ability. And I guess the question is, what should I do? Should I keep pushing my cutting edge forward by doing lots of reading, or should I try to catch up my listening ability by doing lots of raw listening? And the answer is you should do both. Because basically, when you're doing refolds, it's natural that your reading is going to be better than your listening. That's kind of just a given. It's always going to be like that. So what this basically means is that reading is where you're going to be pushing your cutting edge of the language forward. And what I mean by this is it's during reading that you're actually going to be learning new words, getting a lot of more nuance of the words that you know, learning new grammar structure. So it's when you're really kind of at the limit of what you know and you're pushing that limit forward, increasing what you know. And then when you listen, there's going to be lots of things that you actually know, but you can't even pick up because it's too fast, it's too blurry. And so you're trying to just catch your listening ability up to your reading ability, and you're trying to close that gap. And so basically, what's most efficient is to do both, because if you, let's say this one's listening, this one's reading, right? There is a gap, but if you don't do any raw listening and all you do is read, then your reading's just going to get better and better and better, and your listening is going to stay the same, and the gap's going to get bigger and bigger. And when this gap gets excessively big, that causes a lot of problems, because the bigger the gap is, then the harder it becomes to actually catch your listening ability up. First of all, just for ego-related reasons, because when you get really good at reading, then you get used to understanding the language and you start to feel competent in the language. And then whenever you try to do raw listening, you suddenly have this giant, decrease in your ability, and it can be so unpleasant to go back to understanding so little of the language that you just don't want to do it. And then you avoid it even more, and then the gap gets even bigger, and it's just not good. And then the other thing is that when the gap gets too big, your brain becomes excessively reliant on basically making inferences about the language when you're listening. So when you're actually listening to the language and you're trying to understand it, two processes are happening at the same time. One is that your brain is actually listening for what sounds it's hearing, what intonation patterns it's hearing, and it's putting things together based on all these pieces it's picking up. So it's kind of like a bottom-up process. At the same time, there's this top-down process that happens where basically your brain is saying, okay, what likely is being said in this situation? What word is likely to be said at this part in the sentence, given all I know about the language? And a lot of times you can not make out the sounds very clearly, but still understand what's being said based on this kind of top-down inferential process. Like, for example, in English, if I was going to say like, yo, what are you? You would probably guess that I'm saying, what are you doing? Right? So a lot of times just through having knowledge of the language, through having seen patterns in the language over and over again, seeing other certain words always being used with other words, your brain becomes able to guess what's being said, even if you're not picking up all the sounds properly with your ears. And so having that top-down process, it's always going to happen. It's always natural. Even for native speakers, it's an important part of understanding. And I talk about this in my video called Why You Still Can't Understand Your Target Language. But basically, you want to have a kind of equilibrium or a balance between these two processes, between the top-down process of kind of guessing what's likely being said based on what you are picking up, and the bottom-up process of actually just hearing all the sounds and putting the sounds together. And so if the gap gets too big between your reading and your listening, then when you do eventually learn how to listen, your brain's going to become overly reliant on that top-down process. And that's going to make it really hard for you to properly train the bottom-up process and properly train your ears, because you kind of have this, it's kind of like, if you are partnered with somebody else and you're trying to both do a task together, and your other partner is just like always stealing your opportunities to shine. This is a really abstract example, but it's kind of like when there's two things and one of them is like overcompensating for the other one, then it's really hard to kind of grow the weaker portion, because whenever you're experiencing struggle, that the stronger one just takes over. So that's what happens with reading and listening. You're basically, even when you're listening, you're still benefiting from your reading ability for a degree, for a certain degree. And so that's all just to say, you don't want the gap between your reading and listening to get too big. And so you still want to be doing a lot of reading, because that's what's going to push your cutting edge forward. That's what's going to lead to fast improvement. But you also want to be doing listening so that this gap doesn't get too big. So basically, that you just want to do both throughout the entire process. And that's what I would recommend. So Seth asks, I know you've mentioned Honey and Clover before, but can you just start rattling off your other favorite shows? I've never heard your personal picks. Everyone, please like this comment so we can learn what Matt's favorites are. So yeah, I actually tried to rewatch Honey and Clover recently, and I was really bored, and I actually dropped it after like 4 episodes. So for me, I've been watching Japanese content for over 10 years now, and of course I've become a totally different person today than I was 10 years ago. So it's hard to really say whether or not, one of my favorites from like 5+ years ago, I would still like if I watched today. And in fact, I think it's not, I know it's at least wasn't true in the case of Honey and Clover. So I can tell you what I like today, and I can tell you what I liked a long time ago. And for the things that I liked a long time ago, most of them I haven't rewatched recently, so I can't guarantee whether I would still kind of approve of them and whether it would still be one of my favorites if I watched it today. And the other thing I'll say before I actually get into it is that for the past couple years, I haven't been watching a lot of anime. I don't really know if this person is asking specifically about anime or if they're just talking about Japanese TV shows in general. I used to watch a ton of anime. Then I went through a period where I watched very little anime, and I've been watching more anime recently. But so I like my anime recommendations are like the most out of date, because these are all shows that I liked when I was basically a teenager and in my early 20s, and now I'm in my late 20s, totally different person. So basically, the anime that I really liked back 5+ years ago, when I was like really in my age days, are I went into my anime list. The 5 that I had as my like top 5 anime were Genshiken, Tatami Galaxy, or also known as Yojo Hanshin wa Taike, Bakemonogatari, Cowboy Bebop, and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now I'm pretty sure I chose these as my top 5 favorite anime on my anime list because I thought it would make me look cool and like I had good taste in anime. I also did like the shows, but in hindsight, I'm skeptical, like how much was this my true favorite, or how much was it that I thought I would look cool if I said that these were my favorites. But other shows I know I really liked were Death Note, Hikaru no Go, Fate Zero, Psychopaths, right? Yeah, Psychopaths, and Monster. Those are all shows especially Hikaru no Go, Death Note, Fate Zero, Psychopaths. Yeah, and Monster. I'm pretty sure these are all shows I could definitely still stand by today and I'd still like. And then for things that I've watched recently, I recently watched Code Geass for the first time. I know, for somehow I managed to never watch Code Geass. But of course, Code Geass was really good. I already knew it would be good because everyone says it's like one of the best shows. And it was definitely good. I also recently watched Mushoku Tensei, which was also really good. I'm looking forward to the next season of that. And another show that came to mind, this is not an anime, but Hanzawa Naoki is like probably one of the best Japanese dramas that I've ever watched. and definitely, yeah, one of my favorites I watched recently. So yeah, those are some shows that I like. Well, recently I watch a lot of Japanese movies. I watch less Japanese TV. I watch a lot of Japanese movies, and I watch a lot of Japanese like variety shows and a lot of Japanese comedy, and just a lot of Japanese YouTube. I don't watch as many just like fictional series like anime and dramas. When I do watch a drama, it's normally like I watch it with my girlfriend and we watch something that's like kind of cheesy. So I do enjoy that, but I wouldn't really say it's like so many of the shows we watched are like a favorite. Although maybe Nigeru wa Haji Dago Yaku ni Tatsu is like pretty good. That might be a favorite that we watched together. But anyway, Tyler Fouts asks, when in the comprehension phase, would you say it's considered conversationally fluent? I'm more interested in being able to speak and comprehend Japanese conversationally. I'm getting pretty close, but super advanced kanji and reading I'm not so interested in. So when you are in the comprehension phase, would you say it is considered conversationally fluent? I mean, I'd say you're conversationally fluent if you can have conversations with a native speaker about most general topics, and your language ability does not inhibit you from connecting and communicating with the other person in any significant way. Maybe you still can't talk about more advanced topics like politics or philosophy, or maybe you can't really talk about the nuances of your emotions and things like that as well, but you can talk about most everyday topics and it doesn't cause you any problems. So that's what I would call being conversationally fluent. If you're in the comprehension phase and you can't actually speak the language yet, you're not conversationally fluent. So being, for me, for example, I went from basically not speaking at all to being conversationally fluent basically instantly, because I got so much input and I put off speaking for so long that for me, when I started speaking, it came really naturally, really instantly. So for me, you could say, okay, I was in the comprehension phase. That's not really a term I use, but you could say I was in the comprehension phase and I was also conversationally fluent. But I think a lot of people, they're in the comprehension phase and they can't actually speak the language yet because they've never done it before. And to some people, speaking doesn't come as naturally as it came to me. So if you're in this position, you can't actually speak the language, you couldn't actually have a conversation with a native speaker, then I don't think you're conversationally fluent. But the other thing I'll say is that labels like fluent or conversationally fluent or native level, this is what they're just labels, right? They don't really matter that much. I wouldn't really worry too much about them, because what really matters is what can you actually do and what do you actually want to be able to do? Can you do all the things you want to be able to do? If yes, then great. If not, then you probably want to improve your ability. And whether or not you meet someone else's definition or label of fluency or B2 or native level, whatever, that doesn't really matter, right? All that matters is, can you do what you want to be able to do? And everyone defines these terms differently. So I wouldn't really worry about like, do I count as this label or not? I mean, I know it's easy to say that, and it's hard to actually do in practice, right? We all want to know, am I fluent? Am I not? But I mean, really, everyone has a different definition. And so that's why I don't really care that much about my definition. I have a definition of what I think fluency is. I don't really care about it, and I don't really like talking about it that much, because I know that's just my definition. Everyone else is different, and talking about where to draw the line and where you're fluent and where you're not doesn't really change anything substantive about the language learning process. But anyway, that's just my little rant. Dan asks, hi Matt, what's the best method for sentence mining when reading with an iPad or Kindle? I think you've made a video about this before, but I can't find it. Maybe now you have an easier method. Could you explain how you do it? Refer to the guide where it is, or consider making a tutorial about it. It would be greatly appreciated. So, to tell you the truth, basically sentence mining has got so advanced and so complex in the past few years that I pretty much stopped following it. It just kind of became like this constant, like, okay, what's the newest sentence mining fad that's out today? Someone made a new program, someone made a new script. This other program got updated, and it was just this constant upgrading, and it just kind of felt like it wasn't worth the time and energy that it takes for me personally to be like constantly chasing the newest kind of like sentence mining trend. It just didn't, like, for me in Japanese, I don't even do sentence mining anymore. I use Anki, but it's really just to learn the pitch accent of rare words that I still don't know the pitch accent of. I don't really use it to learn new words. And so I don't really need to sentence mine. So that's why it also is kind of like, why am I following all the sentence mining stuff? So for me personally, I kind of stopped following it. So there probably is some new, better method out there that I don't know about, that if you ask around in the community, you can learn about. What I personally do is, I mean, yeah, on an iPad, it also depends on like how are you getting the book that you're reading, because I think even with Kindle, depending on whether you bought a book from a bookstore versus whether you downloaded the file for the book and you manually put it onto your Kindle, that actually changes what you can do with the highlights that you do. If it's a book where you downloaded it from the internet and you put it on your Kindle, then I'm pretty sure you can just highlight things as you go in the Kindle, and then you can export those highlights into a text file and then make Anki cards with that. I think also at one point there was some program where you could like automatically make Anki cards out of your Kindle highlights or something. But I don't really like that much automation. I think there's a sweet spot when it comes to automation, when it comes to making sentence mining easy, where if it's too frictionless, then you're going to basically just like make too many cards for too many things that you don't really need cards for. It's when you have the right amount of friction that you only make cards for things that you really need a card for, and you pick more carefully. It gets you thinking, is this really worth looking up or not? And that kind of metacognitive process, I think, helps with the learning process, and also just helps your cards be more high quality and things like this. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. Like you don't want zero friction with the sentence mining process. You want the right amount of friction, which isn't a lot, but it's more than nothing, I would say. So yeah, I mean, what can I tell you more concretely? I mean, that video that I made on how to do sentence mining from with a Kindle, that was using Alazar Bunko books, and that video is still up. I can find the link to it and link it in this video, because that's still a valid method. I would still do that if I had to relearn Japanese today, because there are a ton of Alazar Bunko books you can get access to. So yeah, sorry for not having like a better, more succinct go-to explanation, but yeah, there's just so much stuff out there that I think you're probably going to be better off asking around in the community with people who like stay up to date on this rather than asking me. But I will link my video with the method that I think it sounds like you've seen in the past. So Ashirogi asks, "Hi Matt, you said if you were doing things again, you would take a listening only approach and wouldn't use Anki. Specifically, how would you go about growing your vocabulary?" I would grow my vocabulary the same way that I grew my vocabulary in English, which is just through getting tons of input. And this is actually basically what my friend Ken did, Ken Cannon. I interviewed him on my channel. He learned the most common, probably like 1,000 or 2,000 words. And after that, he just immersed, and he never looked anything up. He just did a shit ton of immersion. And through comprehensible input, he learned enough words to be super fluent. And I guess one thing that he did do that I would probably do as well is he would watch a show with English subtitles first, and then he'd watch an episode with English subtitles, and then he'd rewatch that episode without the subtitles, and that would make it comprehensible. So instead of like formally learning this word equals this, he kind of would just like do these tricks to make the content comprehensible as a whole, and he would really leave all of the like he'd leave all of the like analysis of the language and how it works and what words mean what. He left all that to his unconscious mind, and consciously he'd only focus on the meaning. And I think that's what I would want to do if I ever learn another language, which I probably will. I'm probably going to try to take this approach, just because I think, yeah, it would be a lot harder, it'd be a lot slower. That's why I don't actually recommend it to people. But I think the result is you would end up with much more native-like language ability, because it's kind of like you want to have native-like ability. Well, do what a native did to get that ability. So I wouldn't do anything formal to learn vocabulary. I would just get really, really comprehensible input, a shit ton, and I would let my brain figure it all out on its own. So Diogo, I know you told me how to pronounce your name the last time you asked a question, but I forgot. So I apologize. I'm probably mispronouncing your name again. Diogo asks, can you have too much repetition if boredom isn't a factor? For example, if a show only has around 40 episodes, is there a point at which rewatching the show one more time gets subpar results, and it would be better to watch another show, even if I feel like rewatching that show for the literal 10th or 20th time? What about intensive immersion? If I already did one pass at that show with intensive immersion, I imagine doing a second pass after many months is great, but how about a third one right after finishing the second one? Considering I never get bored, that is. For context, I'm in the middle of stage 2B, and this is all assuming that in each rewatch, there are still things I don't completely comprehend. So yeah, there's definitely going to be a point of diminishing returns with the repetition, even if you take boredom out of, if you subtract boredom as a factor. And I would say actually this point comes relatively quickly, but it also depends on what type of immersion you're doing. So if you're talking about intensive immersion, I think for the most part, even if boredom is not a factor, I don't think I would ever intensively go through a show twice in a row. I would wait at least 6 months and between every time I go through it. And even then, I probably wouldn't do it more than twice. Because the thing is, there's this concept of low-hanging fruit. That's kind of the main driver of the language acquisition process, is there's things that you don't know yet, but you're able to understand with little to no effort just because you already understand all the prerequisite knowledge in order to understand that thing. So as soon as you come across it, it clicks and you're good to go. And so if you just finish watching a whole show, you've already absorbed all of the most basic low-hanging fruit. Now, to a certain extent, by absorbing that low-hanging fruit, you're going to improve, and things that before used to be I+2 are going to become I+1. So things that before weren't low-hanging fruit become low-hanging fruit, and you can get that new low-hanging fruit on a second pass of the show. And another thing is that there's a certain aspect to where the fact that you already understand the whole plot and all the characters and everything that happened, and you learned all the words that you learned the first time, that it will just make everything a lot more comprehensible. So I think you can go through a show twice, probably even back to back, and still get a lot of benefit out of it. But after that second time, now you're going to be experiencing really, really extreme diminishing returns, where you're probably going to be better off going to another show where there's new low-hanging fruit, because you already will have picked all the low-hanging fruit in that show. So that's talking about intensive immersion. When you're talking about free flow immersion or passive listening, then that's where things are really different. Because like I talked about in the first question in this Q&A, we're all going to have a gap between our listening ability and our reading ability, and repetition is best for closing that gap. So rather than doing it in intensive immersion, that's when you're really pushing your cutting edge forward. That's normally going to happen through reading or through watching the subtitles. Intensive immersion, I wouldn't really do repetition in that form, because basically you're going to experience two extreme diminishing returns. But when it comes to listening, you can listen to the same thing over and over and over and slowly close that gap and get your listening ability better and better and better. So I would say you could probably do a lot of repetition in free flow immersion, but even then, eventually you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns where you've pretty much, even in the listening domain, got all that you can get, and going on to a new show is going to be better. So, in that case, I'd say with free flow immersion, I wouldn't watch the same show more than 3 times within a period of maybe 6 months. And you can do a lot more with like passive listening, because it's not active, so you're not experiencing with high density. So maybe you would say you could do twice as much. You could watch like the whole show up to like between 6 and 10 times. And after that, yeah, probably you're going to be experiencing diminishing returns, and it's going to be better to just watch a new show that's in the same domain, but you haven't actually consumed it before. So Cam asks, do you think the process of catching your listening skills up to your reading skills is a process that works differently than general language acquisition? And does listening skills need to be treated like more than one skill? I can understand easy anime at high level 4, maybe level 5 comprehension, and I'm wondering how to optimize my listening immersion. Easy anime gives me the most comprehensible input, but hard anime has a way higher density of words I only recognize while reading. So I'm wondering if this is a case where less comprehensible input is actually better. To the second part of my question, all anime is clearly enunciated, so hard anime seems like pure practice of word recognition, whereas when I listen to live streams, the language is not that hard, but the slurred and fast pronunciation makes it hard. When I listen to streams versus watching hard anime, am I working on 2 different skills? Should I split my time doing both? Yes, this is a good question. So the first thing you said is, do you think that catching your listening skills up to your reading skills is a process that works differently than general language acquisition? Well, I think it is part of general language acquisition. It's definitely a different process than acquiring the language through listening the first time, and it's also a different process than growing your listening ability. So it is a unique process. But it's ultimately still language acquisition. It's still the language acquisition center in your brain that's doing all the work, and it's mostly unconscious. It's mostly about you getting comprehensible input, and everything else happens subconsciously and kind of falls into place on its own. So it's still general language acquisition in that sense. But yeah, of course, when you already know all the words and it's more of your brain learning to recognize the words that you already know, that's a different, in a sense, it's obviously a different process than learning words the first time. But another way to put it is that basically to have a comprehensive fluency in a language, you need a whole set of skills. And depending how you divide this up, this could be anywhere between 10 to maybe 50 and maybe 100 different skills. And so you need all of these 10 skills, let's just say arbitrarily, 10 skills developed to be fluent. And depending on your approach, you're developing the skills in a different order. So if you take a listening approach, then your ability to parse the sounds of the language gets really high really early on, and then you learn the words later. Whereas when you take the approach where your reading gets good and you catch your listening ability up afterwards, then your knowledge of the words and the grammar gets high early on, and then later on you catch up your listening ability and you kind of develop the ability to hear the sounds that someone who took a different approach might have done earlier. So you end up with all the same skills in the end, but you develop them in a different order depending on your approach. And all of these different skills happen within the domain of general language acquisition, I would say, or within language acquisition. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I would say that there are many sub-skills when it comes to listening ability. And in general, I actually, that's how I always broke it up myself, is basically the ability to like parse the grammar in real time and identify the word, like basically recall the words in real time versus just picking out blurry speech and being able to follow along with blurry and fast speech. And so it's kind of like, yeah, you could say it's the difference between understanding a YouTuber talking fast versus understanding an audiobook. In an audiobook, everything's already enunciated, so picking out the individual sounds is not very challenging. But in an audiobook, they're going to use lots of big words you're not used to hearing. And so you might have that experience of like, oh, that sounds familiar, but it takes you too long to recall the meaning of the word. Or maybe, you know, you can't tell the difference between different homophones that are pronounced the same, but they have different meanings and things like that. That's one skill versus listening to really fast speech where it's all blurry and you're like, I can't even hear what sounds he said. I don't even, you know, I couldn't even tell what vowel that was or what consonant that was because it just sounded like a blur of sound. Being able to parse that is like a different skill. So yeah, I would say it is probably productive to think of listening ability as these two separate skills, and you want to, I mean, practice them separately, but also probably you want to choose one and focus on it at a time. So for a period of time, you could say, okay, now I'm focused on getting better at understanding blurry and fast speech, and you listen to a lot of streamers. And then at a different point in time, maybe you want to get better at understanding audiobooks or anime, where the problem is just that the grammar structures are so complicated and the words are so rare that your brain can't recall the meaning of them fast enough in real time. And so you want to build an intuition for those higher and less common words. And so, yeah, I'd say those are pretty much two different skills. It makes sense to think of it that way, and you probably want to practice them. Probably not at the same time, just because it'd be less efficient than kind of choosing one skill and focusing on it before working on the other skill. So Callum asks, if you were solely focused on listening comprehension, would you make audio cards or just focus on letting the natural acquisition process do the work? I'm currently making sentence cards with text on the front, audio and definition on the back, but I got thinking that audio cards would probably better suit my goals. However, progress would probably slow down and my reading would pretty much stagnate. So yeah, I kind of coincidentally already basically answered this question. If I was going to relearn Japanese, I would take an all listening approach and I wouldn't use Anki. I would basically just do what Ken Cannon did. I would do other things to make the process to make the input more comprehensible. Like I would rewatch things a lot. I would, watch it once with English subs and then watch it again right afterwards without English subs. I would do things like that at the beginning, but I wouldn't actually, learn things out of context. But if I wanted to take a more moderate approach, then I think it does make sense to basically have audio cards where you can make cards and you can have audio on the front and then the text on the back. And a lot of people in the community do that, and I hear a lot of people having really good results with that. So I think, yeah, making audio cards with audio on the front is still a good option if you want to take a more kind of middle approach between the all listening approach and the, super reading heavy approach. I think that's still a good idea. And as long as you have the text on the back, your reading ability will still slowly get better. Then again, it's the act of reading, even seeing the text on the back, that has the bad effects that normally people who take an all listening approach are trying to avoid. But of course, you can get some of the benefits with a small amount of cost if you probably had like audio on the front of your cards, text on the back. I think, yeah, a lot of people have had good success with that. So Kristen asks, I found an extremely effortless sentence mining workflow a couple months ago and consequently have a considerable backlog of cards. I'm wondering if stopping sentence mining and just immersing will benefit, telling my brain that all this ambiguity is really important to solve. Would the benefit of making passes over unknown words during sentence mining outweigh that? So, I mean, I don't think basically immersing without looking anything up will like make your brain any more motivated, because if you're like, I mean, it's a good question actually, because this is kind of the problem I said. If you have a frictionless sentence mining workflow, it's actually not so good for you, because you're going to make more cards than you need, and making the cards are going to be so effortless that, yeah, maybe you do get some weird effect where your brain's like, oh, I can just, I can get the meaning by just pressing one button, so I don't need to actually retain this stuff. I don't think that's a very significant or serious thing to worry about, but it is something that I could kind of see maybe happening. The bigger kind of downside here is that you want to be learning words in the SRS that you've come across recently and that you have an experiential reference point to, you have some kind of connection to. So you want to be watching a show, making a card, and then like the next day or at least the next week, you learn that card and you still remember where it came from. The experience of making the card is still really fresh in your mind. So you remember exactly what the scene was, who said it to who else, and what the significance of the word was. Whereas if you have this huge backlog, and so you're basically learning cards that you made weeks or months ago, well, then by that point, you're going to have forgotten the actual context and exactly what was going on, and you're going to lose that personal connection to the card. And then it becomes more like you're using basically a pre-made deck, that there's these impersonal cards that you don't really remember. And so that is a bigger downside. And also, you want to be learning the words that are most relevant to you at a given point in time. So, maybe you watched a show a couple months ago that had a ton of unknown words, but most of those words you don't really come across anymore. So now you're spending months learning these words that you came across in some show that you watched months ago, whereas you're not learning the words that are coming up all the time in the shows that you're watching right now. So instead, it's always better to kind of limit yourself to only mining what you can actually learn. And that also, by doing that, right? Like, let's say you're only going to learn 10 cards a day. Well, you should only mine 10 cards a day. And if you come across 30 unknown words, but you force yourself to only mine 10 cards a day, now you have to make decisions about what is actually what is the word that is most worth my time, right? Is this going to be one of my top 10 words for today, or is it not? And even the act of trying to make this decision, it is good for the word learning process itself, because when you take a second and you think, is this important or is it not? You're already that's your first connection to that word. You're making a mental dictionary entry for that word. And even if you end up deciding to not learn it, you're probably going to remember when you come across it again, because you might actually remember, oh, I remember, thinking about whether it was worth learning this word or not, and I decided not to. So anytime you kind of exert a little bit of mental effort, like, you said your setup's effortless, but actually it's the act of exerting effort that leads to the most efficient learning. And so that's why I think limiting yourself to only mining the amount of cards you can learn, it helps you make better decisions, and also it helps you learn the words that are most relevant to you at any given point in time. And then you also get to learn the words while they're fresh. So that's why I wouldn't really recommend this kind of strategy of like getting a super effortless workflow, making 1 million cards as you go, and then you just have this giant backlog, and you end up having to learn cards that you made months ago that isn't even really a good card. It's not even really a word that's worth learning for you at this point in time, and it's just kind of not being that efficient. So what I would probably recommend is maybe just delete your backlog and start making actually 10 cards per day, and making them like really high quality cards, the cards that are most relevant to you based on what you're consuming at that point in time. And I don't really, and I think if you do that, then you'll still get that same effect of your brain thinking it's important to learn, because it's going to go, oh man, there's so many words I need to know. I can only learn I can only learn 10 a day or 15 a day. That's so slow, and I'll be motivated to try to absorb more quickly, I think. So that would be my strategy. So yeah, the Q&A is only a little over half an hour long, but I've answered all the questions that have been asked at the point in time of me recording this. So again, if you have more questions, or if you have questions, generally, please ask them so that I can make these videos longer, provide more value to you guys. But for now, those are all the questions. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.